the European longsword, the symbolic weapon of knights of the Renaissance. Pretty simple weapon, right? You put one hand here, put the other hand here, and you swing it at the other person. That's all there is to it, right? Not so much. It's actually an extremely versatile weapon that can be used in tons of situations, from close quarters fighting in alleyways to fighting against armored opponents. And there's a lot of different ways to hold it for various different purposes. Even like this. I'm going to show you a bunch of very weird, unorthodox ways of holding the longsword and using it that you might not be aware of. Ooh, no, Jesus! So let me show you some of the most simple ones first. So this technique is really simple. You essentially put your index finger over top of the crossguard. This allows you better control for various techniques, better point control, but obviously one giant risk factor is that your finger is here, so if a sword ends up here, there goes your finger. There are certain versions of this weapon that have an actual ring for your finger to go into, which is a solution to your finger being exposed. Another very easy one is putting your thumb on the back of the flat of your sword. And basically what this does is it gives you the ability to balance your sword for certain attacks. Putting my thumb underneath the sword like this makes it much easier to do this technique. It can also give you a little bit extra leverage when your sword is in a bind with your opponent's sword. Another grip with the longsword that most people are probably familiar with is half-swording. Essentially this is holding onto the blade, which may or may not be sharpened. It's very good for fighting up close, and it's the preferred method of fighting with a sword against another person wearing heavy armor. There's various ways to hold this. But essentially the function remains the same. You can stab straight into them. If they get your point out the way, you attack in with the pommel. You're essentially rowing and wrestling your way in until you can achieve a grapple or strike with either end. Then using both hands, you thrust or strike with a lot of force. Another useful technique is to put both hands on the blade, and as Fiore puts it, use the sword like an axe. This is called the Mordhau. And a lot of people, when they see this technique, are a little perplexed by it at first. They don't realize what the advantage of holding the weapon like this is. This is a technique that you would probably pretty much only use against armor. The crossguard might actually be sharpened, so you can thrust the crossguard at your opponent. And the pommel, which is the counterbalance to a sword, would actually sometimes be spiked, but it didn't necessarily even need to be. Fiore says this is like using the sword like an axe. But you can also do other techniques, such as using the crossguard to hook somebody's head or their legs. Alternatively, you can use one of my favorite techniques, and that is to use the sword like this. Essentially what you're doing is using the sword like a winged spear, but just shortened. You use your crossguard the same way you would as a spear. Essentially what you do is catch the spear in this little groove here, push upwards, and then you can move in and attack at close range. This can be done with two hands, or one actually, with a spear in the other hand. Using this same exact position, you can also use it to knock swords out of the way by holding it vertically. That brings us to the reverse grip. This is a historical way to hold a sword, but it only exists for a handful of techniques. Essentially, if we were spear fighting, I would draw my sword, which I would have to do in the reverse grip with my left hand, outwards like so. Then holding the weapon straight up and down, we would knock away incoming weapons. From here, while I'm defending myself, I could thrust in. Now, this technique is only recommended at a certain range. If your opponent gets too close, it's recommended that you use a dagger. Now, that's very interesting. Fiore has a very similar technique with a dagger where you're defending against a sword. There are dagger techniques where you can defend against a sword by holding the dagger against your forearm. Presumably, you could do that with the sword. There's an interesting video I've seen by John Clements where he holds the sword like this, sort of like a baton. And essentially, he defends incoming attacks by catching them in that same groove. I find it interesting. He's got a couple of interesting techniques in there. But this is not a historical way necessarily to hold the sword. Here's a very similar one where we use the cross guard. We don't get very much context for this. The author of this manuscript is unknown, and there are no instructions on what we're doing. It simply shows an armored fighter using this end of his sword to deflect an enemy's attack, but kind of works exactly the same as using it in other positions. It might give you an advantage for strength. Using the groove here to stop enemy attacks.
Whose sword is that? You just have to train yourself to react.
There's one technique for deflecting an incoming throw of a spear or javelin that is similar to this, but not this. This comes from Hans Telhofer. Essentially, you hold the sword like this. There's some variations of it. Doesn't really matter. You hold it outside of your elbow like this. You hold it down at your side as you fight. You have a spear in the other hand. If your opponent throws his spear at you, essentially what you're going to do is you're going to bring this upwards, see there, to deflect the incoming javelin or spear to protect yourself and get it away from your face. Also, another technique, while holding the sword like this, you can place it in front of you, essentially aiming your spear over top of it. You can use it to guide your shot. Then, as your enemy attacks in at you, you can defend yourself also. Fiore gives us a very similar way of holding the sword, but that's for throwing the sword itself and not a spear. He calls this the Sagittarius or the Archer Guard, and essentially he means for you to throw the sword like this. Now here's a really interesting one. Essentially what we do is we take our sword, we're going to put it under our own right arm with our wrist on top of the cross guard. We're then going to take our left hand, place it underneath our right arm, and cross it like this. From this position, we turn our body this way and point our sword towards our opponent. This is really funky, and it doesn't feel comfortable. Essentially, if our opponent attacks us in this way mentioned here, where they're going to eventually whine in with their sword, we're supposed to come up somehow and block the attack? I don't know. Essentially, the idea is you're supposed to move your opponent's sword out of the way. I don't really specify how you're supposed to do that, because you're supposed to end up with the point in their face after displacing their attack. So, it could be something like that. Knocking your opponent's sword out of the way, then winding in. I'm not going to lie, I'm not a master of that technique.
Usually we start.
Here's another one with no text or context. Kind of an interesting setup. Not very versatile, but kind of strong. This may be depicting somebody being disarmed. It's hard to tell exactly what's going on. Oh wait, I got it wrong. Oh, geez. Forget all that. So I'm putting my arm over top of the sword. Okay, my wrist goes behind the sword and on top. Alright, that's freaking weird. Okay, forget everything I just said. This is awkward. I don't know how to fight like this. I'm just going to assume the other guy's been disarmed, possibly. I think the real technique is the person on the right, because he's got the right idea. Yo, look, drop my sword. We don't need to do this. Forgive me for all that crap I was talking. Another technique where we put our sword underneath our arm goes like this. Essentially, we're going to put our sword under our left arm instead of our right arm, and then we're going to place our left hand on our pommel, and we fight like this. Essentially what we do is we hold our sword kind of like this, maybe more vertically, like this actually, and I look at it, it actually kind of disguises the sword very well. Interesting. Essentially what we're supposed to do is as we pull the sword out, we're supposed to move our left hand onto the blade, half sword, and then put the point in their face. This position is called the cron. Essentially, from here, you can defend against a blow like the Mordhau. And then, depending on which way your opponent's sword goes, you can then wheel around with either side of the blade. Alternatively, what we can do, when we unfurl this technique, we actually end up in a completely different position. This is called the unicorn. This might look sort of like the ox, which is a very fluid guard that can flow into various different techniques. The way Paulus Hector Mair shows it is that the thumbs are facing the opposite direction. That's what gives it its strength and locks it in place. Instead of holding it with the right hand in the back and the left hand in front, he shows it with the left hand behind the right hand, which makes this very difficult to do very much with. What Mair's advice is to use this simply to thrust at your opponent, and this is a very strong locked position if you are sure you have the thrust. And essentially after the thrust, you're supposed to zverch at him with crossed hands. Our hands are already crossed. I don't know. It's pretty much impossible to do anything on the other side of your body. You can only attack like this when in this position. So you can thrust and then maybe wiggle your sword around. I don't know. I've never been able to make this move work myself. Maybe other people have different suggestions. The next grip we're going to show isn't one horn but two. It's called the Bicorno, and it is called the two-horn guard, which also translates to the strong guard. Translations around the time also translate Bicorno to strong, so you could call this the strong guard. This has also been translated to the anvil guard for some reason, but I'm not showing it. Essentially what you're doing is, much like a long guard, instead of holding the sword like this or like this, what we're going to do is we're going to take our left hand and wrap it on top of the sword like this. In German fencing, this is called the winding. Essentially, when you're locked in a bind with your opponent, you can use this to wind through to your opponent's face. This is very strong. It's very versatile. Fiore says it can do anything that several other guards can do. It's one of my favorite guards. Very versatile, sneaky, tricky, strong, and it can deliver very powerful thrusts. Now, as far as Fiore's version of this guard goes, it's depicted differently in all four of his books. Sometimes it's shown like this, with the sword angled straight up. Sometimes it's shown up on top of the head, sort of like a unicorn. In the Pisani Dasi, instead of showing the left hand on top, it's showing the left hand underneath, sort of like this, kind of at the throat. And I really like this because I like keeping the hand kind of loose, gives you good hand pommel manipulation, good for very attractive fluid movement. But anyway, the European longsword, extremely versatile weapon, lots of different ways to use it. I think I covered a lot of the coolest and most unorthodox ways to hold this thing. But if I missed any, make sure to let me know. I'll see you guys next time.